Men call war a game of chess, but from the driver's seat of a mud splattered command car, it looks more like a slaughterhouse run by poets. I have spent my youth staring at the back of a man's head who believed he was born to die in the smoke of 1,000 cannons. They say history is written by the victors, but it is actually forged in the grease under a fingernail and the silence between two explosions. To the world, he was a god of iron and ivory, a titan who could command the tide of blood to rise or fall at his whim. To me, he was a heavy weight in the passenger seat, a man who feared nothing but the day the shouting would finally stop. I watched the light die in his eyes the moment the radio crackled with the order to halt our advance before we reached the heart of the enemy. Tears, hot and genuine, carved tracks through the dust on his face as he realized his destiny had been stolen by a signature on a piece of paper. In that moment, the invincible conqueror looked like a ghost haunting his own victory. My journey into the fire began long before the world went mad, back when I was just a boy with oil in my veins and a wrench in my pocket. I was born in the year 1918, a child of one great war who was destined to become the mechanical heart of the next one. By the time the second global conflict consumed the horizon, I knew every bolt, gear, and gasket of a utility vehicle like the lines on my own palm. My commanders soon realized that I was not merely a driver who could navigate a map, but a mechanical surgeon capable of performing miracles in the dirt. I once pulled an entire engine from its steel mount in exactly 40 minutes, a feat of raw speed that left the seasoned mechanics staring in disbelief. A representative from the Ironworks Corporation was so impressed by my efficiency that he gifted me a specialized curved wrench that allowed me to reach the most stubborn bolts in the transmission. It was this reputation for mechanical brilliance and steady nerves that eventually placed me behind the steering wheel for General Arthur Sterling. Everyone called him Iron Mask because of his rigid, unyielding expression and the way he stared through men as if they were made of fragile glass. I had driven for high-ranking officials before, including the Supreme Commander himself, but Sterling was a different breed of human altogether. He didn't care for the comfort of a limousine or the safety of a rearguard bunker protected by miles of barbed wire. He wanted to be where the air tasted of sulfur and the ground shook with the rhythmic drumming of the heavy guns. He loved the small, agile scout cars because they could weave through the chaos of a collapsing front line with the grace of a predator. When the cameras were rolling and the newsreels were being filmed for the folks back home, the general was a spectacle of theater and pure bravado. He would stand upright in the moving vehicle, a towering target for every sniper hiding in the forest, just to show his men that death was an invitation he hadn't yet accepted. The soldiers would cheer as we roared past their muddy trenches, shouting questions about whether we were heading straight to the Iron Citadel to end the tyrant's life. Sterling would just nod, his jaw set like a steel trap, looking every bit the warrior king the public demanded in their morning papers. My view was different as I saw the man who sat down when the crowds vanished, replaced by a brooding intensity that could set a map on fire. He never spoke of his home, his family, or the quiet life he had left behind across the great ocean. Our relationship was defined by the humming of the engine and the long, heavy silences that filled the cabin between isolated command posts. He didn't want a conversationalist to distract him from the geometry of the battlefield. He wanted a shadow that could navigate a minefield without asking why we were there. "Just drive, Grease," he would say, his voice a low, gravelly growl that seemed to carry the weight of 10,000 souls. I learned to read the back of his neck, noticing how it turned a deep, dangerous crimson when his plans were being throttled by the slow-moving bureaucracy of high command. He would stare out at the passing ruins of ancient villages, his eyes darting back and forth as if he were counting every broken brick in the street. Occasionally, he would mutter to himself that a certain maneuver wouldn't work. dismissing a week of high level strategy in a single dismissive breath. Despite his reputation for being a hard edged disciplinarian with a heart of flint, the common soldiers worshiped the ground his tires rolled over. He had a way of speaking to the rank and file that made them feel like they were the most important pieces on the entire tactical board. He wouldn't just bark orders from a distance, he would step out into the knee deep sludge to help push a supply truck that had lost its traction in the rain. I remember a moment when a senior officer mocked him for directing traffic like a common patrolman in the middle of a torrential downpour. Sterling just grinned, wiping the grit from his brow, and told the man that a good leader should be a good policeman if the situation demanded it. That was the secret to his power, the shared knowledge that he was just as dirty, exhausted, and hungry as the men he sent into the breach. I grew to like the man immensely, even when his intensity made the hair on the back of my neck stand up in a silent warning. He was never cruel to me, and he never scolded me for the bumps in the road that occasionally sent him bouncing off his seat. Once, after a particularly violent jolt that nearly threw him from the scout car, he simply adjusted his gear and asked if I could see the road any better now. He had a comical side that appeared in the strangest moments, often masking a mind that was constantly churning through tactical possibilities. Sometimes his face would turn so red with repressed passion or anger that I feared he might suffer a heart attack right there in the passenger seat. He pushed himself with a relentless energy that seemed to defy the limits of human biology, driven by a singular obsession with reaching the heart of the enemy. One of the most legendary parts of the general's uniform was his gleaming, mirror finished combat helmet that seemed to catch every stray beam of light. It wasn't standard issue, at least not by the time our dedicated maintenance crew was finished with its transformation. We had a commanding officer fly to a liberated coastal town just to secure a specific type of high-grade industrial lacquer for that piece of steel. We applied 8 individual coats of the thick liquid, sanding it down with meticulous care between each layer until it was smoother than a polished diamond. You could drop a single strand of hair on it, and it would slide right off, unable to find a single point of friction. Water didn't just bead on that surface, it fled from the metal as if the steel itself were cursed or blessed by some strange magic. He wanted that shine because it served as a beacon for his men, a silver star in the middle of a gray and brown world of mud and ash. When the sun hit that helmet, every soldier for a mile knew that the general was moving among them, sharing their danger. We kept 3 of these helmets in the back of the scout car, each one maintained with a level of devotion usually reserved for religious relics. I even took the small metal stars from the front of the vehicle when we moved between commands, keeping them as tokens of the time we spent in the heart of the storm. One of the stars was given to a young soldier who was driving the general's armored transport, but I still have the others tucked away in a velvet-lined box at home. The helmet was more than just protection. It was a symbol of an era where a man's presence could change the outcome of a battle. Taking care of the general's appearance was a full-time operation involving a dedicated officer known in the Army as a dog robber. Major Silas Vance was the man responsible for the general's wardrobe, ensuring that every button was polished and every seam was straight. He would spend hours buffing the general's boots until they reflected the flickering candlelight of the command tent like dark obsidian mirrors. If the general decided he wanted a specific uniform ready for a dawn inspection, Major Vance would stay up all night to ensure it was perfect. The general was a man of absolute punctuality, often waking me up at 4 in the morning by sneaking over and shaking my shoulder. He didn't wait for the bugler to sound the morning call. He was already halfway to the car before the sun had even considered rising. I remember the night we had to drive to a secret high-level meeting at a small red schoolhouse hidden in a valley near the border. It was 3 o'clock in the morning, and the fog was so thick I could barely see the radiator cap of the scout car as we crept along the dirt paths. All the big names were there, the men whose faces would eventually be carved into the marble of history books and school texts. Sterling spotted the Supreme Commander's massive Cadillac and told me to pull right up alongside the polished vehicle with an air of playful defiance. He leaned out, shouting a greeting to Supreme Commander Vance that was far too loud for such a somber and secretive hour. The commander looked at Sterling, shook his head in weary frustration, and asked him why he wasn't wearing his regulated combat headgear in a war zone. Sterling laughed it off, claiming that a man of his stature and experience didn't need a piece of tin to protect his thoughts from the enemy. The Supreme Commander didn't find the joke amusing at all and told him that as long as his men were dying in the trenches, he would follow the rules. He ordered Sterling to go back to our camp and retrieve his helmet before the meeting could officially begin in the schoolhouse. I saw the flash of genuine irritation in the general's eyes, but he just gave me the silent signal to turn the car around and head back. He muttered something under his breath about sticking his foot in his mouth again, a rare and honest admission of his own recurring fallibility. We returned 20 minutes later with the lacquered helmet shining under the dim moon, and the meeting finally proceeded in the cold, damp shadows of the classroom. Then there were the famous sidearms, those twin revolvers with the ivory-colored grips that caught the sun whenever he walked through a liberated town. The world thought they were genuine elephant tusk, a gift from some exotic king or a relic of a bygone era of cavalry conquest. In reality, they were a triumph of battlefield ingenuity and a few scraps of thick, salvaged plastic I had found in the ruins of a factory. I took those scraps to a talented technician in our unit who could carve a masterpiece out of a discarded comb if given enough time. He spent days sanding the plastic down with crocus cloth until all the marks of its humble industrial origins had completely vanished. A few layers of brilliant white paint and a thick coating of lacquer later, the general had the most intimidating grips in the entire theater of war. I don't know if the general ever realized the truth about the material, but he wore them with a pride that made the plastic look more valuable than gold. He would walk around with those pistols strapped to his hips, the white grips contrasting sharply against the dark leather of his holsters. It gave him an air of an old-world gunslinger, a man who had stepped out of a legend to lead modern armies into the abyss. Where else were you going to find real pearl or ivory in the middle of a scorched earth campaign across the lowlands? We did what we had to do to maintain the myth, because the myth was what kept the men moving forward when their legs wanted to quit. The general was the star of his own movie, and we were the stagehands making sure every prop looked exactly right for the final act. There were stories, of course, about his legendary temper and the times his passion for the mission boiled over into something much darker. People still talk about the time he supposedly struck a shell-shocked soldier in a field hospital, but the truth of that day is far more complex. I wasn't in the room, but I knew the man better than any journalist who wrote those scathing reports from the safety of a hotel. The boy was suffering from nerves, a soul shattered by the relentless rhythmic drumming of the heavy enemy artillery. Sterling didn't see a victim in that bed. He saw a dangerous leak in the dam that was holding back the tide of the enemy. He didn't beat the boy, but he did strike the helmet with his gloves, a symbolic attempt to jar the courage back into a heart. The media made the incident into a monstrous crime, painting the general as a heartless brute who had no sympathy for the suffering of his men. In reality, Sterling couldn't tolerate the idea of a coward because he believed that fear was a disease that could infect an entire army. He went up to the front lines just like the common soldiers did, exposing himself to the same whistling lead and jagged shrapnel. He never talked to me about the hospital incident, but I could tell that the public backlash and the temporary loss of his command hurt him deeply. He spent weeks in a sort of exile, pacing the floors of his quarters like a caged lion waiting for the chance to hunt again. When he was finally allowed back into the fight, he was more determined than ever to prove his critics wrong through victory. One of his greatest triumphs was capturing a key industrial town before Field Marshal Blackwood could even get his tanks fueled and ready to move. Blackwood was a methodical, slow moving commander who preferred to wait for every piece of equipment to be perfectly in place. Sterling had no patience for such caution and drove his units forward with a speed that bordered on the suicidal. When Blackwood finally arrived at the town, he found Sterling already sitting in the mayor's office, drinking a victory toast with his exhausted officers. Blackwood was furious and complained to the Supreme Command, but Sterling just offered to give the town back if the other man wanted it. He knew the value of momentum, and he wasn't about to let a rival's bruised ego slow down the march toward the Iron Citadel. The men followed him because he possessed a natural, raw leadership that didn't rely on the stars pinned to his shoulders. He would talk to a group of 20 privates as if they were his equals, discussing the conditions of the field with a man-to-man honesty. In those moments, the hierarchy of the military seemed to dissolve, leaving only a group of men trying to survive a nightmare together. If a private had a better idea for crossing a river or flanking a machine gun nest, Sterling was more than willing to listen. He was called blood and guts by the press, but the soldiers often joked that it was our blood and his guts that won the day. Yet, they said it with a smile because they knew he would never ask them to do something he wasn't willing to do himself. We spent the final months of the war chasing the retreating enemy across a landscape that had been turned into a graveyard of burned out tanks. The general was obsessed with the pace of our advance, constantly checking his gold pocket watch and urging me to find more speed in the engine. He didn't want to just win the conflict. He wanted to be the first one to kick down the heavy doors of the Iron Citadel. He would sit in the passenger seat with a massive map spread across his tired knees, his finger tracing the lines of our progress. The radio stayed off for most of the trip because he couldn't stand the constant nervous chatter of the backline strategists and planners. He knew what had to be done to end the slaughter, and he didn't need a committee of men in clean uniforms to tell him. The end of the dream came not with a roar of cannons, but with a crackling, distorted voice over the long-range transmitter during a cold rain. We were miles ahead of our nearest support columns, the road to the capital open and completely undefended for our final historic charge. Then the order came from the highest level of the Supreme Command. We were to halt our advance and wait for the Eastern Allies. I watched the general's face transform from a mask of iron determination to a portrait of absolute soul-crushing defeat in a matter of seconds. He stared out at the gray horizon, at the city he had dreamed of conquering for years, and he realized he would never enter it. It was the only time in our entire journey together that I saw genuine tears falling from those hard iron-gray eyes. After the official surrender was signed in the spring of 1945, the energy seemed to drain out of him like water. We stayed together for a few months longer, mostly so I could help him organize his personal papers and pack away the massive maps. He had a specialized van built for his travels that contained a comfortable bed and his personal effects, but he rarely used it for sleeping. He spent his nights staring at the wooden walls of his quarters, his mind still fighting battles that the rest of the world had forgotten. When the talk turned to the ongoing conflict in the Pacific, he showed no interest in joining the fight on the other side of the world. He told me the commanders over there were doing a fine job and he didn't want to interfere with their glory. I remember a quiet evening when he spoke about the new, terrifying weapon the scientists had finally developed and tested in the desert. He wasn't a man who enjoyed unnecessary slaughter, but he believed in the absolute cold necessity of victory at any human cost. He told me that if such a devastating power existed, it should be used immediately to stop the constant bleeding of our own young boys. When the news finally broke that the war in the Pacific was truly over, he didn't join the wild celebrations with the rest of the camp. He just sat in the back of the scout car, his hand resting on the ivory grip of his pistol, looking at the silent hills. He was a creature of the storm, and I realized then that the sudden, heavy calm of peace was a silence he could never survive.